Good evening, and welcome to 7 Stories Up, She's Always Hungry by Eliza Clark with Allison Nellis. We're delighted to have you all joining us this evening at the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library. My name is Tim Smith, and I'm a supervising librarian here at SNFL. Before we begin, I would like to thank the Stavros Niarchos Foundation for making programs like this evening's conversation possible. I would like to encourage you to visit NYPL's website and take a look at upcoming programs like this one. We have an excellent lineup this season featuring new nonfiction, music, and more. We would love to have you join us in this space again. And it's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Eliza Clark is the author of Body Parts and Penance. Body Parts was Blackwell's 2020 Fiction Book of the Year and was later adapted for the stage. In 2022, Eliza was chosen as a finalist for the Women's Prize Futures Award for Writers Under 35, and in 2023, was named one of Granta's Best of Young British Novelists. She also writes for film and television. Eliza lives in London. Eliza will be in conversation with Allison Nellis, who is our supervising librarian of programs and outreach. And it's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's guest.
Thanks, Eliza, for joining us. Before we kind of begin, by a show of hands, how many of you have read She's Always Hungry?
Oh, great. That's good. That's a good result.
That is a very good result. Because we were just like, oh, we don't want to spoil it for anybody, but also we want everyone to read it. So the book has been out for a while. Congratulations. It's amazing. So my first question is, what made you want to put out a series of short stories?
Well, I had them done for ages. So around when Boy Parts came out, which was my first book, I had enough short stories that I could have a short story collection. So I sent them to my original publisher. Boy Parts is like publication story in the UK. It was originally published by an independent press, and then it was bought out by Faber a couple of years later. So I think I showed it to like my original publisher, and then we didn't really do anything with it. And then we took it out to wider submission. And that was like in early 2021. So it just kept getting pushed back and back and back in the publishing calendar, until I had changed out and re-edited almost every single story in the collection. And that's showbiz, I guess.
And what was the writing process for these stories like? Did it differ from your longer form books?
I think so, yeah. I feel like when you sit down to write a novel, you've got to be super intentional about it. Like you really got to deliberately sit down and write a novel, because it's just such a sustained process. It's like you have to keep doing it for like months and years in some cases. I think in most cases now. I think I wrote Boy Parts in less than a year. I don't think I'm ever going to write a novel in less than a year again. Whereas a short story is kind of, at least for me, something that I can just kind of do on a whim and then return to. So I find that short stories are actually a lot more organic and kind of fun, I guess. They're a lot more vibes-led when I initially sit down to write them, and then I will kind of go back and edit them and do a lot more like structural stuff on them. I don't like to imply that I just kind of sit down and do a complete short story comes out and it's perfect in one go. Sometimes I definitely think that I've done that, and then I come back to it in like 6 months and I'm like, no, that was garbo. And this is unreadable. But it feels like quite a different process. Like I sort of strongly associate writing short stories with it being like something super fun, something that I really want to do. I've had the idea for the story and I've kind of like sat down and had this like really fun kind of couple of days or a week with it, and then I kind of go back and change it out. Whereas a novel is a lot more of a kind of banging my head against a brick wall, sweating, thinking it's shit and not looking at it for 2 or 3 months and then coming back to it and realizing that it was shit and I was right. And I need to cut 20,000 words from it, whereas I've never had that experience with a short story.
And so some of these stories are a bit older. What was it like to kind of go back and kind of rework with them, revisit them? How much did you tear them apart to rebuild them again?
Yeah, it was interesting because like I suppose when you looking at like an old piece of work, you can choose to have two reactions to it, which is one, to be mortified and throw it out, or two, to kind of think about how you can improve it from quite a detached position and have like almost like have fun editing it as if you didn't write it, but also you were working with like a writer that you didn't have to have any kind of sensitivity to or any kind of desire to respect their vision in any way, shape or form. You can just kind of go in and rip it to bits, which is really fun. I quite like the editing process, which I've been told makes me a sort of sicko among some writers, but like I really enjoy editing and fixing things and kind of ripping them up and fixing them and putting them in different orders. I think the oldest story in the collection is Hollow Bones, which has like existed in some form since like 2015, where I like started writing it and I wasn't quite like good enough to kind of finish it yet. And then I did finish it at some point in like 2016 or 2017. And then I've come back and done like 3 or 4 drafts of that. That's lost like 4,000 words over the course of the years. It's changed titles. It's been restructured completely. Yeah, so some of them have, like, I think there's, what else was really old? There's a story in there called Titles of My Own Stories. Sorry, this is, my short-term memory is really poor. Oh my God.
You're also very jet lagged, so.
Yeah, I am, like, I'm, like, so jet lagged. For me right now, my body thinks it's midnight. And I'm like, I should be in my pajamas. And now I can't, hang on. God, it's the one with the face. It's the one with the acne cream. Shake well, thank you. Thank you so much. That one's super old as well, which is why I couldn't remember the title. It's that was written circa about 2018. So that was that, Build a Body Like Mine, and 2017, 2018, that and Hollow Bones. And Shakewell was like, that just lost like a lot of flab when I went over it the last time. I think like the voice was kind of there, whereas Build a Body Like Mine had like a really aggressive restructure. It was actually, you might be able to find it somewhere, but it was published online from like a small press called 3 of Cups Press, which went under about a year ago, well, 2 or 3 years ago now. So that was published in its original form online, which I don't know if somebody manages to dig it out. It might be quite an interesting comparison because that had a quite an aggressive restructure as well. But yeah, no, I think it's quite fun going back and kind of tearing stuff up once you've gotten over the initial, like, why did I think it was okay to structure a sentence that way?
Now, is that something that, as you move through your career, you would want to do, I don't know, recreationally? Because I know musicians will sometimes go back and rework some of their old work, but I think I'm not a writer. I'm just saying it might be fun. But is this something that you would do in maybe like 20 years, 30 years, kind of seeing how they still work?
Yeah, I've been really interested in the idea of doing that for Boy Parts specifically, because that was, I wrote that sort of around the same time that I wrote that handful of short stories. I was on like a mentorship scheme and I wrote a bunch of short stories, and then I started writing Boy Parts. Boy Parts was originally a short story that I then extended a lot into a novel. And I would really like to go back in and fix like a bunch of stuff in Boy Parts, which is what happens when you write a novel when you're like 24 and it gets published like 2 years later. I actually think they should legally not allow you to publish a novel until you're like 30. They should make you desk draw it and then take it back out and re-edit it, because there's a bunch of stuff that I just wouldn't like. There's like, I remember like doing a bunch of interviews at the time where I was like, oh, there's nothing in Boy Parts that's in there for just purely for shock value. I just have like a really like high baseline for like shock, which is actually something that Irina says in the book, which is really cringe. And I was like, and then now I go back and there's at least 2 or 3 things that are just in there for shock value that I would totally cut now.
It's like, oh no.
Yeah, Eliza.
About how many stories did you write for She's Always Hungry?
Do you mean once I like sort of had already kind of gotten it?
Yeah, like, are there some that are in the vault that we have not seen?
Yeah, there are. There was one that was actually because it was in there when we sold the book. It kept coming up in the marketing copy up to like last year, and I kept having to be like, I cut that's 2 years ago. I cut it 2 years ago. Which was like it was like a vampire thing set in it was set on in Oregon Trail kind of era America. It would have been cool, but it was like it started as like a Wendigo thing, and then I read a lot more about how white writers shouldn't necessarily just use that like it's a kind of generic monster, and I thought like, oh shit. And then I changed it to be a vampire, and then it kind of felt like the story actually kind of doesn't work if it's a vampire, and it was also garbage, and there was like too much going on in it thematically, and it was like I'd had like a novel sized idea and kind of tried to cram it into like an 8,000 word short story, and it was like unsalvageable. I really tried to fix it. That was the one that was originally called She's Always Hungry, actually.
Oh
no. And so that was also like so the story, the title story, which is now called She's Always Hungry, was originally called Fisherman's Pride. And I was like really thinking, like, I tried to write like a new story that I could like backwards compatible the title She's Always Hungry onto. And then when I was going through it, I was kind of like, you know, that title actually works fine for Fisherman's Pride. That'll do.
And it works very well. And we'll talk about She's Always Hungry in a few minutes. The one thing I'm a huge horror fan, and I think the one thing that I was really happy to see when picking up this book is that there is a content note on it, and that included is a content guide so that readers can navigate what stories may trigger them or not. And I do want to commend you for putting that.
Oh, thank you.
I think a lot of people who work with books are like, that's kind of censoring, but it's also, I think you're putting that power back to the reader.
Yeah, well, I think like because I watch a lot of films and I'm really interested in film censorship. Like in the UK has like the most censorious film board in Europe, which is really interesting. Just from the way that kind of like functions, like almost as like a bit of a kind of like decency and morality police, but also how they've often had like a genuine interest in getting art to the UK, but just like decently. They're a really odd organisation. The BBFC are fascinating if you have any interest in film censorship, if you're a fucking dork like me, I guess. But yeah, and I've always kind of thought like the BBFC do like full reports on film. So if you're like, they're kind of, I guess, kind of like the IMDb parents guides, but they're a lot more like, I would say like a lot more clinical and a lot better. Because they're not like user generated, like somebody a film censor will sit and watch and report what is in a film. And I just kind of thought like, I'd kind of never have understood why we don't have those for books, when it's just like, it's something that you don't bat an eyelid when you see it before a film. But when it comes to a book, it's suddenly kind of like, oh, you're doing a censoring thing because of woke. And it's like, well, I'm not taking anything out of it. I'm just giving people the opportunity to not have like a panic attack while they're reading a book because something has suddenly come up that they weren't expecting.
Yeah, because I can't even tell you the amount of times I picked up a book and I wanted to read it, and I've had to put it down because I was just like, oh, I didn't realize that was in here. And I think with you including it, I think that's really powerful to do, especially in a genre like horror, where I think it's so extreme and it's supposed to evoke such a huge emotion. I think it really says something to how much you care for the reader.
Thank you. Yeah, because I think a lot of people go, I personally go to horror for that. Like I go to it to feel kind of bad and fucked up and upset. But I appreciate that not everybody, there's like a kind of bad and fucked up and upset that you might want to feel, and another kind that you might not want to feel. And yeah, I don't know. I just think it makes sense. But I also appreciate that people sometimes find very detailed content warnings spoilery, which is why I put it at the back of the book specifically, because I also think that people who maybe want to get fucked up have an option to go into it completely blind, I guess.
And this collection, you work in a number of different genres. What was it like, kind of genre humping? That too, genre jumping for this. Like you work in sci-fi, you work in like folk horror. What was that process like?
I suppose it was just, I guess, kind of like I was saying at the start, it was like a very vibes-led collection. So most of it was just kind of what I was wanting to write on the day. And I have very broad taste. I kind of, in terms of like film, TV, and books, I will kind of watch or read anything, as long as it's good, which is obviously like a really vague thing. But I think people are often kind of like surprised at the stuff that I like, because it doesn't necessarily seem like the kind of thing that I would like, I don't know, Conclave. I love a film where a bunch of people sit in a room and argue very, very eloquently for like 2 hours. That's I love that, as long as it's good. But yeah, I think I'm just sort of interested in like a bunch of different stuff. I was talking to the writer Helen Oyeyemi. I don't know how familiar you are. Yeah. She was talking about this idea of what she calls like maximalist fiction, where it's just kind of like pulling in as much, kind of like the biggest sort of stories that you can kind of make, and like the biggest, how many influences you can have, and that almost feeling like there's no limit on it. And I think that's something that I really kind of like. I quite like having the entire kitchen sink in my work. I think it's quite fun, for me at least.
So we're going to start doing like the story specific one. So if you have not read the stories, close your ears. The first one I do want to ask you about, I think is the longest story in the book. I think it's 30 pages, is Hollow Bones.
Yes.
Which is a sci-fi story.
Mm-hmm.
I want to know a little bit about your approach to world building, because when I'm a sucker for a good short science fiction story where you don't feel like, you felt like the world has been built up in a way that doesn't feel rushed. And I do want to commend you for that. I think that's a sign of you as a skilled writer, and it's absolutely brilliant. But I just want to know a little bit about your world building approach for that.
Yeah, I lost a lot from that, basically, is that like I did like a lot of world building, and I think I feel like one of the things that's important for making it feel kind of like developed without making it feel overstuffed is being prepared to just cut stuff. And it's like, I remember it, I know that it's there. If I ever want to kind of like return to this sort of world, I can. But I think a lot of that was just being prepared to lose like a bunch of cool world building stuff that was cool, but it wasn't like serving the story in any other way. So that was originally like, I think it's at about 8,000 words as it is in the collection, about 30 pages. And originally it was more like 12,000. And it was a lot of like extra detail and stuff that wasn't really there for anything other than like extra detail. Like I think there was a whole thing about there having been like a massive civil war in the USA, and that there was like a massive influx of US refugees to China. And that there was like a bunch of, I guess, kind of stuff like that hadn't quite gotten in. I think there might have been like a bunch of stuff about how the protagonist was like, she was like the only person that thought aliens were real, and spent like a bunch of time running around trying to convince people that aliens were real, and then eventually found out that aliens were real and got to be like, haha. Which is, I think, something that I sort of ended up losing, was that the protagonist of that story is actually like in her 40s, and people often describe her as like, I think I even maybe like her early 50s, and people will be like a young woman. And I'm not saying that 40 to 50 isn't young, but it's sort of maybe not the immediate descriptor you would go to. Which is, I think I ended up doing that because I read somewhere that the most average person on planet Earth is a middle-aged Han Chinese woman, and I almost felt like that should be like the stock sci-fi protagonist, as like the average person. But yeah, there was like a bunch of stuff that just went from Hollow Bones to make it not be like super overstuffed. I sort of softly consider it to be in the same universe as Extinction Event, which is one of the other science fiction stories, but they're like almost like 50 to 100 years apart or something like that.
So the next story I want to talk about a little bit is the title story, She's Always Hungry. What was your inspiration behind the story?
There are couple of like big ones. I think that I'd like wanted to do something with the idea of somebody who keeps like a mermaid as a pet for like years, like a really, really long time. I'd had this idea I had half an idea for a story, because that is half an idea. You need something else. It can't just be about a guy keeping a mermaid as a pet, as I found out while I was sort of had tried to write a version of that at some point. I was like super influenced by, or at least I stole the idea from, there's like a series of Japanese exploitation films called the Guinea Pig series. And the fourth one is called Mermaid in a Manhole. And it's about an artist who finds a mermaid in a manhole, and then takes her home and just paints her over and over again while she like deteriorates in a tin bathtub. Or I don't think it's a tin bathtub. There's a tin bathtub and She's Always Hungry, but not in that film. And I was really like, there's just something really interesting about that idea. And there's also another weird Japanese film called Marabaito, which is, it was the guy that made all of the Grudge films, and he did it between Grudge films. And it's a really, really odd film about a like weird divorced man who goes under Tokyo and finds that there's like a massive civilization under there, and finds like a sort of weird vampire girl and takes her home and keeps her as a pet. And again, I thought there was something kind of interesting about taking that dynamic and like flipping it around a bit as well. Who is keeping whom as a pet? It's impossible to say. And I just couldn't quite find like a way to do it in a way that was like interesting or a bit more fleshed out. And then while I was doing the research for Penance, my second novel, I read a book called Killing for Company, which is a non-fiction book about a British serial killer called Dennis Nilsen, who was from Scotland. And he was from rural Aberdeenshire, where there are all of these fishing villages that end up kind of being quite matriarchal by default, because so many men die very young while they're fishing. And there are also, in the specific village he was from, there are only about like 6 or 7 families there, and they only had like a few last names, and they were only using like a few quite traditional first names. So there were like, they had like this very elaborate nicknaming system called T-names, which I thought was like linguistically so interesting. And I just kind of thought like, oh, this is like the setting for the mermaid thing. This is like a perfect kind of way to just sort of smush 2 ideas together, or to steal 2 things and combine them together to make a new, somewhat original thing, I guess.
One of the other things in She's Always Hungry that I thought was really interesting is the gender dynamics of this town. It's, very female centric, but you do have all of the male characters who are referred to by possessive of their mothers, which I thought was really interesting. How did you kind of come about that idea for this? I mean, you touched on it a little bit.
Yeah, it was from that. I kind of bounced off the T names that they were using in those fishing villages in Aberdeenshire, where it was like they would kind of refer sort of quite elaborately to someone by who was their mother or who was their father, and then like using like the mother or the father's nickname to refer to this person and stuff. And I just thought that was so interesting. So I thought that, and in the north of England, we have like kind of a quirk where you'll refer to someone you refer to as like "ah." So to kind of differentiate them from other people. So if you were talking about 2 people called like Stephen, it would be like, do you mean your Stephen or our Stephen? And I thought I just kind of quite like that. I think it's quite sweet. And I thought, what's a way to take this like sweet dialect thing and make it a little bit weird and possessive and gross? Yeah, and I don't know. It felt like it was doing something that felt kind of like complicated and like weird, but also hopefully relatively easy to understand on the page as well.
This is a story that also relies very heavily on mythology. And kind of mermaids and folklore. Can you talk a little bit about that and where that came from?
Yeah, I kind of, sometimes when you're writing something like this, you choose not to do any research. And I think with folkloric stuff, I feel like sometimes you can almost be at risk of like borrowing too much. So there are obvious kind of like folkloric parallels between like the idea of like sirens and the idea of selkies and the idea of a lot of that kind of miscellaneous hot woman in the sea.
Hot fish lady
thing. And I think it was sort of like, I almost didn't want to get too bogged down in the specific folklore of it. I just kind of wanted to think about my own sort of version of this kind of general thing. So I didn't do, which is always, it always does feel kind of bad when you're on stage and you're like, I actually didn't do any research at all. I actually didn't care about that. But it's not that I didn't care. I suppose it was that I kind of made a decision to not like, gum up the story too much with too much different folklore. I think it's interesting to kind of talk about that in the context of like the story about the Wendigo that I cut from this, where it was so reliant on like another culture's piece of folklore that it like broke the story. And I didn't want the same thing to happen again, I guess, almost.
And I think there are so many different cultures that have this kind of story in it. This hot lady in the sea, hot
it feels
fish
very
lady.
universal, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The desire to have sex with something that you found in the sea, I guess.
Great for people who love The Lighthouse.
Yeah.
But it's also like if people are reading it and they have that in their own culture, they can almost project their own image on it, which I thought was really interesting. But yeah, we need more hot fish ladies in the sea stories.
Yeah, it was actually Elle Nash sent me a really funny reel that was like a skit that somebody did where it was like a pirate in like the 1700s, like, oh, I saw a beautiful woman in the sea, and it was like describe her, and he was like, she was grey and huge, and because he was describing a manatee, scaly.
Yes, thank you.
700 pounds she weighed.
Perfect. So you have a couple of body horror stories in here. The one I want to talk about is A Body Like Mine, which I read maybe 2 days after I went to go see The Substance. And I was like, heck yeah, this story is great. This I think is if I'm giving this story to somebody like you like the movie, you're gonna love this story. But this is one of the stories along with Shakewell that kind of plays upon like either the body or beauty standards as horror. How do you kind of write that kind of human-based horror?
Do you know the most frequently asked question I had on my UK tour? Actually, there were two most frequently asked questions on my UK tour. The first was, have you seen The Substance and what did you think about it? And the second one was, do you like Ethel Cain?
Do you?
Yeah, I like perverts. I wasn't sold, and then I heard perverts and I was sold. I think it was because I like everything that Ethel Cain likes, and I guess I didn't quite initially see how those influences knitted together until Perverts came out, and I was like, there she is. There we go.
We tried to play Perverts before an event last week, and we had to turn it off because they're just like, no, this is not a welcoming song.
No,
this is not a welcoming album. I'm like, all right.
Really though I do support playing more dark ambient electronica before book events. But yeah, body horror. Beauty standards as horror. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I feel like those are definitely the two of the older stories in the collection, just because I feel like it's a theme that I've like moved on a little bit from, that I used to be very fixated on. And I think it's probably because I feel like I don't know, I think it was just something that I was very fixated on my early 20s, because I was like one of those people that I was like super not hot in high school. And then I was like super hot for like 5 years in my early 20s. I'm not saying I'm not super hot now. It was in a kind of like a weird men following me home kind of way that was a bit threatening and weird. And it made me go a little bit insane.
They thought you were a hot fish lady.
Yeah, they thought I was a hot fish lady. They thought I was grey and scaly. Yeah, so I used to think about it a lot. And I used to think about how like... I suppose I still think about it quite a bit, but being very fixated on your appearance and what it means to kind of lose or gain beauty, and how kind of shallow it is, and how I don't know, it's something that inherently kind of exists to recede and break down in some way. I suppose in like society's view of it. I think the French singer Serge Gainsbourg, who was famously a relatively ugly man, said that ugliness is superior to beauty because it endures. And I used to think about that a lot. And I think there's like so much in culture that is wrapped around trying to make sure that beauty can endure for as long as possible. And there's just something so like hollow and pathetic about it. Like I ended up like, I was looking at Liv Schmidt's Instagram for ages. Do we all know who Liv Schmidt is? She's evil, if you don't know, but she's her like entire social media presence is like, it's thinspiration, and she's very focused on being thin and being hot, but she's also like she also really heavily edits her photos in a way that is like really sad. And I think there's just something like kind of really interestingly like complicated and sort of sad, but also completely understandable about pursuing beauty to this like damaging and sort of painful extent that, like, I don't know, because it is something that's always ultimately kind of going to collapse in on itself. It's just such an odd thing to build your entire life and personality around. Or I guess you could kind of like really, really work at it, and it could be the only thing that you do. And you could look like a kind of Hollywood actress when you're like 60, but it's just so much time and so much money, and like the sort of balance of, is that worth it if you're just a person that works in an office or whatever? Like, do you need to look like that? And I don't know. I suppose I'm interested in it. Is what I'm saying. Yeah.
And then the last story that we're going to talk about, which is a staff favorite, was The Shadow Over a Little to Italy.
Yes.
Which like I read this and I was like, you're a sicko for this one. And but in the best way. I said that a number of times while reading this book. But what was the inspiration for this?
Lockdown, basically. It was like I felt like the only form of external stimulation we had in lockdown. The short story, for if you haven't read it, is made up of reviews for a restaurant. Like kind of like we have like Just Eat and Deliveroo. I think it's like DoorDash over here.
We have so many of them.
Yeah,
too many.
But I just sort of started, like, there's an Instagram account called Takeaway Trauma, which I think is a very UK based Instagram account, which just screenshots like insane reviews that have been left for takeaways, and often the sort of deranged response that the restaurant has given. And I just sat and read the account one day like it was a book. And perhaps I could have read a book instead, but I read this. And I just sort of had the thought of like, what if this was all for the same takeaway? And then I sat down and wrote the Shadow of a Little Chitaly. There used to be a takeaway, and I'm from a city called Newcastle, which is in the northeast of England. There used to be, I'm from the West End specifically, there used to be a takeaway in the West End of Newcastle called Chitaly, which had like a 3 out of 6 on Just Eat, which is very low for those kind of takeout rating sites. And also, people from Newcastle, it's like an interesting accent that we have, but it has like a really pronounced glottal stop, which is when you don't say T's, which is why they put 2 T's in the middle of glottal stop, so I can demonstrate it for you there. So it's not just, so it's Chitaly, so it sounds awful because you're going like Chitaly and doing like a weird stop in the middle of it. And I just thought it was profoundly unappetizing as a name because it doesn't work as a pun. You're like looking at it and thinking, what the fuck does Chitaly mean? Until you realize it's a combination of the word Chinese and Italian. And it was just a Chinese restaurant that did pizzas. It wasn't like a Chinese and Italian fusion restaurant. They just also had pizzas on the menu. And I used to have a friend that was like obsessed with the idea of us ordering from there. And it was like, but the rating's awful. I think the hygiene rating was like on the floor. And it's just something that I've been turning around in my mind for like a decade, I guess. It's closed now. And I just kind of, I think that's one of the ones where it, like, that basically is the first draft that's in there. I went in, I overcooked it. I had to take a bunch of stuff out because it was better the first time I did it. It was just a flash of pure inspiration and brilliance, I guess. I laughed a lot while I was writing it. There was a really funny review that She's Always Hungry got in the UK. I think it was in the iPaper, where the reviewer fucking hated it. She hated that story so much, and it was almost like she didn't realize it was a joke. So it was like a sincere review of The Shadow of a Little Chitaly as like a sincere horror story that had horribly misfired. Fascinating.
When I was like, what are the streets saying about this tale? And I went to Reddit, and Reddit weirdly loves this story.
It tends to be a fan favorite.
Yeah.
It tends to be the one that people like the most from it, which always kind of is a little bit like, well, it was the lowest effort one, but okay. I'm fine.
So if you had to pick one of the stories from the book to flesh out into a larger piece, which one would it be?
Good question.
Thank you.
I always felt like if I wanted to adapt something, I've I've said that I would like to do The King, which is one of the last stories for film, but I don't think I would want to flesh it out too much. I would want to kind of keep it almost as is, which is why it would work better for film. I had a quite a slightly uncomfortable meeting with a TV company that were like convinced they could make a TV show out of it. While I was kind of being like, I don't know. And it was a very odd back and forth. When somebody's arguing with you about whether they think that they can extend your own story into a TV show, and you're kind of like, nah. I told them to go and watch Tokyo Gore Police as a tone reference, and I just think it's really funny that the three women that I'd sort of had an argument with over Zoom probably went away and watched Tokyo Gore Police and thought, yeah, we're not fucking doing this. But yeah, I was like, I think that could work as a film. In terms of like fleshing out more, probably Hollow Bones. I feel like not so much that story, but at least that world I feel like I could do something with. I quite like the idea of doing like a space opera-y thing at some point, so maybe I could do something with that and of all of the sort of world building that I threw out for it. But otherwise I think a lot of them are short stories because that's how long that idea is, if that makes sense. Like I think you can kind of point at, there are a couple of things that you can sort of point at as examples of like when people have tried to extend out short stories where it hasn't worked super well. Like I really, really love Cat Person, the short story, but has anybody seen the film? Yeah, a couple of people. Don't worry about it. Because they like they run out of content from the short story after the first like hour, and it's like 2 hours long for some reason, and there's also like a bunch of extra stuff that they've added in anyway, and it just doesn't quite work. Yeah, I think I quite like I think a lot of them work just as they are, short, not outstaying their welcome.
So we're going to open up to questions in a few minutes, so get them ready. What are some of, to kind of get away from She's Always Hungry, what are some of the writers whose work most excites you right now?
Oh, that's a good question. I feel like I'm trying to read more backlist stuff at the minute, so I think that my answers are probably going to be not super contemporary. But I've been reading more and more Ursula K. Le Guin recently, which I've really enjoyed. I felt like that was a big kind of hole in my reading that I hadn't done a lot of. I've been reading shitloads of Hilary Mantel at the minute. I've read like the entire Wolf Hall trilogy at the end of last year, and I was just so excited by it. It's just such incredible writing. It's very much kind of like, yeah, that's what a novel should be. Hilary really was really cooking with that one. But it is also just nice to have the experience of like, you know, when you pick up like a critically acclaimed novel and you're like, yeah, it does slap. It just rule. God, who else have I been reading recently? Oh, my mentor who worked with me on the 3 sort of oldest stories in this, Matt Wesolowski, I don't think he's been published in the States, but he has like a new novella coming out, which is super exciting because he was doing this long-running crime series called 6 Stories, which is great. If you like my second novel, Penance, you will really like 6 Stories, which sort of got put on pause. But he's got a new novella coming out, and I'm very, very excited about that. I've like just started reading it, and it's really, really good. And he's like I think kind of like an underappreciated master of horror, which is super exciting. And I'm just rambling. I'm kind of having that, you know, those sort of like Billy on the Street interviews where he's like, for $1 name a woman. This is how I feel every time I get asked to name a writer. I'm like,
James Patterson.
Just started reading John le Carré today.
And so kind of in closing, what are you working on next?
What am I working on next? I've been working for about 4 years on an adaptation of my first novel, Boy Parts, for TV. Whether that will ever manifest, I don't know, but hopefully I will soon be released from its clutches either way. It's too long to work on one thing. I'm adapting someone else's novel for the screen at the minute, but I can't say whose. And Gosh, what else am I doing? I've got a couple of other like TV and film bits in the fire, and I'm also in the middle of writing a third novel, which will hopefully be inflicted on everyone at some point in like probably like 2028 at the rate I'm going. Yeah, it looks like it's going to be super long, and it's like a sort of sci-fi kind of thing, which I hope will, I guess, alienate my entire fan base.
That's fine. Right. So we're
Really off-putting.
really off-putting. So we're going to open up to questions. We have mics floating around. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. I think we have one right in the front.
Hello. You've talked a lot about film and TV. I'm a filmmaker myself, and I was wondering, like, what are your biggest inspirations from that in writing your novels, or like vice versa, when you're writing novels or short stories, how does that inspire your film and TV writing?
Ooh, that's great. Yeah, I feel like every project almost has its own kind of like unique like matrix of stuff. The same with kind of each short story. I could probably point to like a film that I was sort of in part bouncing off of. Like I think Boy Parts was like super influenced by Michael Haneke as the piano teacher. I love Michael Haneke. And the novel by Elfriede Jelinek, but to be honest, to a lesser extent than the film. I think with She's Always Hungry, I could almost just kind of go through, and we'll see if I can actually get to that contents page this time. I hit my tooth on the mic. I just thought I'd let everybody know that happened as well. Got to be really careful because both of my front teeth are broken and have plastic caps on them, so I really need to like not do that. I think I already went over She's Always Hungry's influences, but Hollow Bones is obviously like Alien, Event Horizon. Gothguff is also kind of haunted by the spirit of Michael Haneke as the piano teacher. The King is probably an interesting one to talk about in that context because it's like I already mentioned Tokyo Gore Police as like a reference for that, but I love Takashi Miike and that kind of like that like weird kind of madcap, hyper violent, cartoonish kind of thing. I had just finished reading Chainsaw Man, like all of Chainsaw Man I read Chainsaw Man, I read Fire Punch, which is Tatsuki Fujimoto.
That's a rough one.
Yeah. Our generation's greatest storyteller, I think. A generational talent, and I'm not even kidding. And I wrote The King, and I was like super influenced by Fujimoto for that. Company Man was like, I'm obsessed with Chan-wook Park. Lady Vengeance is like, I guess like, you know, the film that you are assigned when you're like 14 that's your entire personality. Mine was Lady Vengeance, and I really loved, I think I'd just come out of seeing Decision to Leave, and I felt like I wanted to kind of do a sort of Chan-wook Park style thriller that had like a big sort of like a big melodramatic twist. So that story does have a big melodramatic twist if anybody hasn't read it. And that one was also really influenced by The Box, which is a short film by Takashi Miike. In fact, I rewatched The Box after this had been published, and I did think like maybe I lifted a little bit too much from The Box for that. And Night Stalkers was inspired by like one line in the book about the Golden State Killer by Michelle McNamara, yes. I'll Be Gone in the Dark, where she talks about like the culture of like just like night stalking in California in the 70s, and she has this one line about like bored teenagers smoking weed in avocado fields and then walking around these nice neighborhoods at night, and I was like, cool, that's like an entire thing, just that one sentence. And then I feel like my reading mostly comes out when I'm doing screenplay stuff, in that I'm for a novelist, I'm like really efficient, and I quickly found out that for a screenwriter, I'm like super slow. So I had to learn to be like way less slow when I was telling stories. But yeah, sorry, I talked for absolutely ages there, but yeah, thank you for your question.
I'm a really big fan and really happy to see you. I
Thank
had to
you.
say that.
Thank
Sorry.
you.
I also want to say thank you for your social media presence, especially in the wake of what was happening in Palestine and
Thank you.
reposting a lot of protests. And I have a lot of British and Irish family, and I was like, did you see this thing? And so thank you for that as well.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
I really loved Penance, and so I know you're not here to talk about that book today, but when I was reading it, I was thinking a lot about Brexit, and I kind of really read it as this like post-Brexit novel, in like such a way it came out in all these different ways in the book. I feel like I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about what inspired you to write that novel when you did, and if you can place it politically a little bit.
Yeah, I was so terrified of it being seen as like my attempt to write a Brexit novel. I think I just felt really, really shy because I feel like we haven't had, it's sort of in some ways it's like so recent, we haven't really had like a big pop cultural mediation on what on earth happened there. And it ended up being such an odd political divide in the country. And it was something that even though I was like demographically like obviously a Remain voter. I think at the time I was living in like the most Remain constituency in the UK. So it had been quite odd. I was living in like Lambeth in London at the time, so it was quite odd sort of coming from like a constituency where I think like nearly 90% of people voted Remain to like be like, what the fuck happened? And I think I've been like very interested in I'm someone who identifies as a skeptic, and I've been really interested in how skepticism seems to have kind of almost collectively flown out of the window, like all over the world. As you'll know, in Donald Trump's America, the people just believe things if they want to believe them now. And I think Brexit was the first time that we'd really felt that in the UK. Like I remember talking to my mom about it, who I think is the person that had made the most sense to me personally on Brexit, where my mother was a civil servant for like 35 years. And she was like, honestly, I just don't know how we will do it. Like, I don't know how we're going to disentangle from the EU because there are so many administrative processes. She was just kind of like almost from like from a purely bureaucratic standpoint, she had no idea how it was going to happen. And I thought like, we got to get this woman on the television to tell everybody that this is like like bureaucratically can't happen. And I was just so interested in how like the way that people kind of got really attached to these like big grand narratives about Brexit, and nobody cared about the actual like things that made sense. And I think that kind of, in some ways, I think that expressed itself as like as part of the wider themes of Penance, of like choosing to believe things and choosing to go along with things, and this almost sort of like madness of crowds thing that comes out in Penance. Which I was kind of convinced was unintentional at the time, because like I said, I was so self-conscious about being seen to be trying to write a Brexit novel. Initially I chose Brexit as a setting because I wanted to have like a big eclipsing news story to wrap the murder around, in part because I had been really like kind of, it's sort of trying to pick a word to use here, I'm going to say interested in, there was a really awful violent murder that happened in like late 93, early 94 in the UK that almost no one has heard of, because it happened like 3 months after an even bigger, more violent murder, which was the James Bulger murder, which had like a massive effect on the UK criminal system. It like lowered the age of criminal responsibility in the UK from 16 to 10. So it was like this huge case that is still something that comes up in the tabloids. And I was just so interested in the idea of something so big and so terrible happening that it eclipses something that is also really big and terrible that happened. I think my other option was going to be the 2012 Olympics, where I was thinking maybe like a news story that like, because the vibe in the UK was, the last time people were happy in the UK was the 2012 Olympics, I think, where there was a real sense of like, oh, we've all come together and everything's good, isn't it? And it was, in little did we know, that was the last time. And I thought about that maybe, using that instead, but it was just ended up being that I was like 18 during the 2012 Olympics. I don't remember it that well, whereas Brexit I remember very well because I had more of a fully formed frontal cortex at that point. So I picked that And yeah, it's sort of interesting that it's ended up maybe becoming like more of a Brexit novel in my head as well. The more distance I've had from it, and maybe the more confident I feel talking about it as like a Brexit novel. I was also like conscious of it being seen as like a sort of political screed, because Brexit sits in quite an interesting political place in the UK, where it was something that our sort of third political party, the Liberal Democrats, were very, very attached to, who have this reputation of being sort of like middle class and spineless and rubbish. And it had this very like, all of the people that I saw complaining most aggressively about Brexit were actually like really privileged, and were kind of talking about how it was going to like affect like properties they had abroad, or like, isn't it terrible that my daughter can't do her year abroad in Italy that she was planning to do? And you're kind of thinking like, this is why people vote with Brexit, is just because of you saying stuff like that. So it's sort of, I don't know, we're very engaged in spite-based politics in the UK. I imagine as you well know in the US. I feel like you're a little bit more engaged in like delusion-based politics, whereas in the UK we're like super spiteful. It's like basically if you can say like, oh, it's actually going to be like really, you're going to have to stand in customs for like an hour when you go to Tenerife, but like this really posh guy's daughter can't do her year abroad in Italy, we will hit the button that says don't let the girl go to Italy over and over again. Yeah, it's bad over there. I don't like it. Yeah, sorry, I've like banged on about Brexit for ages, but oh god, an interesting like note for this is that in Japan, Penance has been published under the title "A Girl Died on the Night of Brexit." Because there is a very famous Japanese novel called Penance already, which I forgot about, and that was my fault. But also because they felt like Brexit would be like it's a thing that people are interested in, which I hadn't really thought of, because I thought of it as such a like niche specific bureaucrat thing that we're dealing with in the UK at the minute. I believe the Japanese title, it's like Brexit no Haini Shoujo Shinwa, I think, which I have memorized because I do like it. I think it sounds, you know, when you get like an anime that's got like a super long title that's been shortened down. It felt like that to me, and I enjoyed that. But yeah, that was me talking about Brexit for 10 minutes. Thank you for your question.
Something I find really endearing about your writing throughout Boy Parts and Penance and a little bit in She's Always Hungry, like Goth GF, is how you manage to make them so of their time with like language and references to brands and websites without them ever feeling dated or pigeonholed. And I was just wondering if you intentionally craft them that way, or if that's just how they come out.
Yeah, no, that's super intentional, actually. I actually think you date your work more trying to be miscellaneously contemporary than you do just saying, like, it's 2018. Which is something that we've been, like, dealing with the Boy Parts TV show, where, like, TV very much usually exists in this kind of, like, non-specific contemporary space, which is why sometimes you have TV that'll age awfully, because it'll have, like, the sort of off-brand Facebook thing that's like not relevant in like 6 months or something like that. Whereas if you just like, if you have somebody using MySpace and say it's 2006, then it's you've like placed it properly. Whereas if you do that and you've given it like a miscellaneous contemporary setting, you're like, why are they on MySpace? What the heck? Yeah, so it's super on purpose. Like, I remember the first edit that Boy Parts had, there's like a reference to somebody having an iPhone 10, and the editor was like, shouldn't we change this so it just says new iPhone? And I was like, no, it has to be the iPhone 10 because it's set in 2018. So that was when the iPhone 10 came out, so people will know that it's set in 2018. And I think that was more of an expression of madness because I had recently stopped working at an Apple store. But also because I think like details like that are interesting. They place it and they make it like a specific period thing. And I would always rather be specific. I think it's just a good general writing tip to be as specific as possible. Yeah.
And when you include those websites, especially with in Penance, where you have these references to like Live Journal and things like that, for people who are in those trenches, it feels a bit more real too.
Yes. Yeah, specific. It's good to be specific. Hi.
Hi, Eliza.
Hello.
Question. I liked that you brought up the idea of like skepticism. I think it's something that you've kind of seen in your work, like increase more so like in Boy Parts, which I'm currently like halfway through. So, we'll see how that goes. And then in Penance and in this, you have these, this concept of an unreliable narrator that like you kind of create these really vivid worlds and we're all inclined to like go along with it. And then you leave us kind of turned around and questioning everything. And like, I'm curious about like your relationship with that concept as a writer who writes these things that like, leave us questioning everything we've just read.
Yeah, I think a thing that's always important to bear in mind when you're dealing with writers is that writers lie. Writers are like some of the most chronic liars I have ever encountered in my life. Not me, I've never lied. But like, I think it's like, and I've always been sort of interested with my own kind of relationship with lying. Like I think it started kind of for me as a teenager when I used to find that my parents would not believe me when I was telling the truth, but they would always believe me when I lied. So I just started lying to them really habitually. And I was always kind of interested in like how like a well-crafted story is more attractive and more believable to my parents, but also to people generally than like the truth. And it was something that I saw more and more as like I started kind of getting into like as an interest like paranormal stuff and conspiracy theories, which is something that like I always like really wanted to believe it, but it just didn't stand up to my own kind of base level of skepticism in a way that like means that I'm no fun at parties. It means that like I don't know. Sometimes I am super no fun. There are like specific things where I just kind of feel I feel like some kind of like turbo Reddit atheist whenever I'm encountered with them. Like I can feel the fedora manifesting on my head.
Milady.
Where I'm just kind of like, well, milady, perhaps if you spent more time studying the blade and less time studying the Bible, that we wouldn't be in this situation. But yeah, I guess I've always been really interested in like the power of storytelling to convince people of things, and almost like how like almost purely negative that effect can be. Like I feel like I'm slightly unconvinced of the kind of positive power of stories. I know that there have been obviously like a lot of positive things, particularly kind of like via representation and stuff, but like I'm unconvinced like politically with what we can do with stories apart from be just kind of like complicating. But there have been some like really, really politically damaging pieces of fiction, which I think is sort of really interesting. And I'm also interested in the way that things can be like completely misconstrued, that sometimes the writer's intention almost just doesn't matter if like people read it in a certain way. Like one of my favorite books of all time is Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita, which is obviously just kind of like the kind of brutal nadir of this conversation for intention versus how it's read versus its cultural imprint versus the massive amount of damage you could argue that book's done. Versus kind of like, I guess the good that you could argue it's done is kind of complicated and muddy and like weird. So it's basically something that I think about all the time. It's something that I don't think I'll ever get away with in fiction. Like I was trying to, in my current novel that I'm working on at the minute, I've been trying to get away from the unreliable narrator almost as like a crutch, that I felt like I was relying on a little bit too heavily, because in some ways it can be a little bit of a crutch, I think, particularly with Boy Parts, which there's like a lot of stuff in Boy Parts that I'll stand by, but having an unreliable narrator does mean like, if anything kind of like weird or inconsistent or like something that you think might be a mistake in my writing pops up, I can be like, maybe it's not a mistake, maybe it was intentional the entire time. I'll never tell. And I found that I was kind of trying to get away from this unreliable narrator, and the sort of story that I'm writing has ended up being like, I've got like a fascist government with like a bunch of really elaborate propaganda. I've got a bunch of people lying to each other. I've got a bunch of different points of view where some people are lying about some stuff and some people aren't lying about some. So I guess I'm just obsessed with it, and I think it's really interesting. And to come back to the writer's lying point. Do you remember there was like a spate on Twitter where you would read some kind of like insane viral story that someone had made up where it was like, you won't believe this. My 6-year-old came up to me today and said, "Mommy, why can't we just get that orange buffoon out of the White House?" And then you would always go to their profile and they would be a YA author. It was like without fail. And I don't know, I suppose I'm specifically interested in like that impulse of like, I don't know, a specific type of person's impulse to make up a specific type of thing is so interesting. Thanks.
How are we doing on time? We're good? Okay. Well, thank you. I think we're at time. Thank you all for your excellent questions. Thank you, Eliza, for coming all the way from the UK for us. If you have your books with you, Eliza will sign them just outside of this room. And it's very quiet, so this is very awkward for me. But thank you all for coming out tonight.